The film kicks off in 1304 near the besieged Stirling Castle in Scotland. King Edward of England was tasked to appoint a successor after the Scottish king's passing. Instead, he grabbed power and harshly took over the country. The Scots revolted under Sir William Wallace, but suffered defeat at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace went into hiding, leaving the English with the upper hand in their battle against Scotland's push for independence. Facing limited options, several Scottish lords, including Robert Bruce and John Cummin, reluctantly pledged loyalty to King Edward. Their confiscated lands during the rebellion were returned. King Edward established a new Scottish administration led by a viceroy, under which Robert and John agreed to serve. As the nobles prepared to depart, Robert was challenged to a friendly duel by Edward II, the English king's son, which he engaged in half-heartedly. The duel ceased when the prince was called by his father to address a petitioner's appeals. During a request made by a Scotsman named James Douglas to restore his family's lands and titles, King Edward I declined, citing Douglas's father as a traitor. The sealing of the treaty between the Scots and Edward the Brun was marked by launching Greek fire at a nearby castle, and the English accepting the fortress's surrender at the evening feast. In a bid to secure favor, the king arranged for Robert to marry Elizabeth de Burgh, an Irish noblewoman with ties to Edward I. Robert reluctantly accepted the proposal, influenced by his father's belief that gaining the king's favor was crucial. His father assured him that the king would eventually fulfill his promise of offering the crown upon their return home. Robert and his father grapple with the consequences of their submission to English authority. Elizabeth arrives and is formally introduced to Robert and his daughter Marjorie by the prince. Marjorie introduces Elizabeth to her dog, Jessie. Their official marriage takes place, but out of respect, Robert postpones its consummation. In the following months, Elizabeth gradually warms up to Robert and Marjorie. However, the strain of English rule weighs heavily on the common people who bear the brunt of the repercussions from the rebellion. The king's men arrive to recruit men for fighting, enforcing the agreement made with the king. A soldier attempts to take a young boy, prompting his mother's protest. Elizabeth intervenes, using her status to prevent them from taking the boy. One evening, Robert's father reminisces about his past, recounting stories from his days fighting alongside King Edward in the Crusades. Despite initially seeing Edward as a friend, he expresses regret for placing trust in him. Shortly after this, Robert's father passes away, making Robert the new Lord of Annandale. In 1305, Robert and his men journey to the border city of Berk to deliver owed taxes to England. While there, they get caught in a crowd gathered at the marketplace to witness the aftermath of William Wallace's capture, his severed arm displayed after being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Chaos erupts as the people protest, and the English soldiers start attacking Scottish civilians defending themselves. Robert witnesses the brutality and horror. Returning home, Robert shares the news of Wallace's execution with his brothers, reigniting his determination to resist English rule once more. Elizabeth, who overhears their conversation, agrees with their stance. Robert meets with Cummin in a church to seek his support. However, their exchange becomes tense when Cummin reveals his intention to inform King Edward about Robert's plans. Robert unsheathes Cummin's blade from his belt, plunging it into Cummin's neck, swiftly ending his life at the altar. Later, Robert admits the killing to the Scottish clergy. In exchange for supporting the Catholic Church in Scotland, they promise him absolution and aid in becoming the King of Scotland, leading the nation against England. Accepting the proposition, Robert prepares to be crowned in the English village of Scone. Edward learns of Cummin's demise and Robert's impending coronation, sparking his rage. Prince Edward II implores his father for a chance to prove himself by capturing or killing Robert. Reluctantly, the king agrees. Meanwhile, Robert rallies Scottish nobles, seeking their support for a renewed bid for independence. While some nobles back his cause, common supporters resist. En route to Scone, Robert encounters James Douglas, striking a deal. Douglas pledges allegiance in return for reclaiming his family's lands and titles. King Edward knights hundreds of men under the dragon's banner, preparing for confrontation. Robert is crowned the King of Scots. Amidst celebrations and battle preparations in a nearby forest, Robert and Elizabeth share a quiet, intimate moment, consummating their marriage. As they put Marjorie to bed, Robert urges Elizabeth to safeguard their daughter regardless of his fate. Strange noises outside their tent interrupt the night's peace. Robert investigates the area, discovering a barrage of fire arrows descending upon the Scottish camp. Ignoring their agreement, de Valence leads an attack under cover of darkness, catching the Scots off guard. Amidst the English assault, Robert entrusts his brother Neil with escorting Elizabeth and Marjorie to Culdrummond Castle for safety under Lord Fraser's protection, a trusted friend and ally. Despite valiant resistance, Robert faces an inevitable defeat. With roughly 50 surviving men, battered and desperate, he flees the battlefield. Beaten and bloodied, Robert and his remaining men wander the Scottish countryside, opting to seek refuge on the home islands of his ally, Angus MacDonald, hoping to bolster their depleted forces along the way. Encountering John MacDougall, harboring bitterness over Cummin's murder, Robert's group is allowed to pass without harm. Meanwhile, Neil brings Elizabeth and Marjorie to Lord Fraser's castle, offering respite from the escalating turmoil caused by Robert's coronation. While crossing a river, Robert and his men fall into an ambush orchestrated by the MacDougalls. In the skirmish, Robert's brother Alexander falls victim to a spear, his body left behind as the Outlaw King's forces dwindle further. Eventually reaching the islands, the remaining soldiers recuperate and garner additional support from those willing to join their cause. In contrast, Prince Edward carves a brutal path through Scotland, ruthlessly eliminating Robert's supporters, pillaging towns, and capturing villages, including Robert's castle. Upon arriving in Perth, Prince Edward reprimands de Valence for failing to apprehend the outlaw and expresses displeasure with his incompetence in tracking him down. Shortly after, a loyal Scottish nobleman arrives and discloses the whereabouts of Elizabeth and Marjorie to the English. In response, the prince mobilizes his men to confront Lord Fraser at Culdrummond. At the castle, Prince Edward demands the surrender of Robert's wife and daughter, threatening an attack if Lord Fraser refuses. Attempting to buy time, Fraser feigns ignorance about their location. Sensing danger, Neil covertly guides Elizabeth and Marjorie outside the walls, advising them to seek refuge in the forest until he can arrange for their protection and safe passage. Amidst a rain of fire arrows into the castle, Lord Fraser, under pressure, offers to open the gates, insisting that Elizabeth and Marjorie aren't present. Despite their persistent denial, Prince Edward orders Neil to be hanged from the castle gates. In a harrowing scene, Neil is disemboweled in front of Elizabeth and Marjorie. The prince then slays Lord Fraser, commanding Robert's wife and daughter to be taken as hostages back to England. Meanwhile, on the island, Robert receives word of Neil's execution and his family's capture, igniting a fiery desire for revenge within the Outlaw King. Returning to the mainland, he continues amassing resources and allies. Understanding the imbalance in forces, he realizes that engaging the English in direct combat would lead to inevitable defeat, given their overwhelming strength. The Scots opted for guerrilla warfare tactics, launching surprise attacks on English fortifications in small tactical strikes. After defeating the garrison at his castle and setting it ablaze, Robert allows James Douglas to lead a similar assault. Douglas infiltrates his family's castle on Palm Sunday during Mass, catching the majority of the English garrison in prayer inside the church. Seizing the opportunity, Douglas and his men ruthlessly engage their enemies, setting fire to the castle before rallying more supporters for their cause and reuniting with Robert. Meanwhile, King Edward III of England grows increasingly aware of his declining health and frailty. Marjorie is taken by a nun to serve as a quasi-hostage at a convent, while Elizabeth's parents are brought to her. Prince Edward II attempts to coerce Elizabeth into signing a document that renounces Robert, annuls their marriage, and pardons her for her alleged crimes against the crown. When Elizabeth refuses and ridicules the prince for his failure to capture her husband, she's cruelly imprisoned in a metal cage suspended over the walls. Upon learning of another raid by Robert's forces, King Edward I is enraged. Determined to personally quash the rebellion, reminiscent of his actions against William Wallace at Falkirk years ago, he musters his army and leads them into Scotland. However, during the march, King Edward III falls ill and collapses. On his deathbed, he instructs his son to boil his body and carry his bones into every battle against the Scots. As he succumbs to dysentery, the prince's final words to his father express disdain, claiming his father's mistreatment stemmed from fear of his own strength. As Edward II exits his deceased father's tent, he orders his men to bury the late king's body there, disregarding his father's final wish. Meanwhile, as the English draw nearer, Robert decides to confront them in a pitched battle instead of continuing to evade. Despite his men's apprehensions, they put their trust in their king and prepare for the impending clash. Choosing a swampy battlefield, they construct cunning traps with ditches filled with sharpened stakes, intending to catch the English heavy cavalry off guard. James Douglas is assigned to intercept the prince and challenge them to battle at the chosen location. The following day, the two forces converge on the field, the English numbering in the thousands while Robert's army barely exceeds 500. Eager to solidify his claim as the new King of England, Edward II orders De Valence and numerous heavy cavalry to charge Robert's awaiting forces. The English realize the trap too late, falling victim to the stake-lined pits, resulting in a brutal, muddy confrontation. Even after Edward II joins the fray with his remaining men, the Scots persistently strike down the English, forcing them into a hasty retreat. In the midst of the chaos, Robert and Edward II engage in a duel, with Robert emerging victorious, though battered. Despite Edward II's plea for aid, Robert spares him and allows him to withdraw with the remnants of his army. This triumph marks the Scottish king's first significant victory against the English. James Douglas earns the moniker the Black Douglas and reclaims his family's lands, while Angus MacDonald is appointed Lord of the Isles. Edward II returns to England and ascends the throne, only to be assassinated by his own nobles years later. The movie concludes with Elizabeth eventually being released in a prisoner exchange, reuniting with Robert and Marjorie. 3 centuries later, one of Robert's descendants, James VI, is crowned King of Scotland and England, culminating the story.